that would be the game changers if we were able to build thousands of new housing units in this region. That would solve the problem. That would deal with the problem. Maybe not solve it, but that would help a lot.
We talked about homelessness in that Big Bite segment and all the different, or at least some of the different agencies and various resources working together to try to help people who have nowhere else to go. That was based on some news that came out of the city of Cincinnati earlier this week, sort of a two-pronged announcement when it comes to what the city is doing to try to offer some new services to people who are unhoused, and then also plans to help buy, if not fully, nearly fully finance, the purchase of a church in Over the Rhine that also does a lot to help people in need. To sort all of that out, we go to Cincinnati Buisness Courier reporter Chris Wettrich, who specializes in a lot of government reporting that the Business Courier does. Chris, happy to have you back on the show. Thanks for your time.
Thanks for having me, Jack.
So this is again, it's a two-pronged thing. There's two different things going on. The city has announced that it is looking to create a day center in a partnership that's going to be sort of a one-stop shop for various needs for people who are experiencing homelessness. And then the second end of it is that the city is helping to finance the purchase by 3CDC of St. Francis Seraph. These two things aren't necessarily related, even though they feel related, right?
Yeah, basically what the city's doing, the St. Francis Seraph campus went up for sale earlier this year. They closed the church. And that's more than just the church. It's important to remember. There's the St. Anthony Center, which is next door, some other buildings nearby. And so the concern on the city's part was that some out-of-town entity could come in, or maybe even an in-town entity could come in and close down the St. Anthony Center and basically, shut down or really put into uncertainty the services that are there. And so the city and 3CDC decided to go ahead and buy the campus from the city's perspective and Mayor Aftab Pureval's perspective. They want to get control of major development sites, and this is potentially one of them. It's located on Liberty Street, busy street. Key part of Over the Rhine, also divides the north and south parts of Over the Rhine. So they felt like it was an important property to have under control so that the city government and the nearby neighborhoods could all have input into what actually goes there eventually. Yeah. And so that's why they went ahead and purchased it.
Yeah, and so 3CDC is buying it, but 3CDC is only kicking in $1 million, and the city is then kicking in another $4 million. 3CDC, which is a nonprofit, right, is going to be operating that. And the whole thing, so the Franciscans just put a for sale sign out. They've been sort of restructuring along with what a lot of the archdiocese is doing. That parish at St. Francis moved up into St. Bernard, I believe. But so there was really no previous coordination, as far as we know, between the Franciscans and the city, and once the for sale sign got put out, that's when people stepped in and said, wait a second, let us help.
Yeah, that's the story that we've been told, is that the city was as surprised as anybody when the church ended up closing and went up for sale, and so they viewed this as an opportunity. I mean, the city's even before this, a couple years ago, the mayor and the city manager had in the budget money for this day center, which they believe is an important, kind of gap in our services for homeless people and folks who are having trouble. And so they wanted to provide a place, that people could go during the day and get services and, basically chill out, get off of the street, more or less. That's something that I don't think people really understand, how homeless shelters sometimes work.
Right.
During the day, they're closed. You can't just kind of hang out there. For the most part. And so, they want to give people a place to go. And in a way, the St. Anthony Center already kind of offered some of those services. They provide meals, care for people's feet, showers, hygiene, behavioral health services, those types of things. And so the city's idea, the way that they're kind of related is they hope down the road that the St. Anthony Center services will be incorporated into this new day center. They're calling it a center of care, but it's really important to emphasize the daytime nature of this. The city's not really looking to build another homeless shelter where people are staying at night. They're looking to build something that's operating during the daytime.
Yeah, and this was, I mean, I remember last year when the city announced that it was doing about $5 million and it was going to buy a facility out in Queensgate. Did that just never shake out, or do we still don't know exactly where this day center of care partnership place is going to be, right?
That's correct. And they're still looking for a site. They don't know exactly where it will be. One thing that the mayor made clear this week was that the day center will not go on the St. Francis Seraph site. So it will be somewhere else. The mayor, emphasized that this will be in the urban core, and this is important because there's been a lot of chatter over the years over the movement of some of these services out of over the Rhine. Right,
Right.
people that is somewhat controversial among some of the folks who kind of think that there's been gentrification and people have been displaced in over the Rhine, and there's been a certain amount of that, of course. But I asked the mayor, look, what do you mean by the urban core? And so he listed Queensgate, the West End, over the Rhine, or downtown as the places where, this would end up going. And so we don't know where the daytime center will be, but we know that he believes that it needs to have bus access to the shelters that are in Queensgate and, some that remain in, over the Rhine. And we know that he doesn't want to like ship it off into some far flung neighborhood.
Yeah, well, and I also remember, when the city announced that it had this unspent $5 million and it had its eye on this Queensgate facility, there was a little bit of reaction at the time too of why would we have the city spend this money to do this thing when it could be used toward existing organizations that are already around? We were talking about how, all the different things that Strategies to End Homelessness does. They already work with the city and the county. There's any number of currently existing organizations. Some concern about why the city was starting a whole new thing to start this whole new thing.
Yeah, and the interesting thing from the news conference the other day is that some of those folks and a lot of the social services are kind of on board now with the daytime
Yeah.
center of care. I think they believe there's some merit to it, and I think they've refined the approach. And I couldn't really tell you exactly what brought them on board, but there seems to be a growing consensus that this is the thing that should be done. But yeah, you're right. Last year or whenever there was a little bit of confusion among the social service community as to what the city was proposing and what it actually wanted to do. And so it seems like there has been some attempts to build consensus down at City Hall among those groups.
So do you have any insight or any thought about what down the road things will look like at the St. Francis Seraph site, like say 5 years from now? Are they still running St. Anthony Center out of there? This is assuming this new center, daycare center, that doesn't sound exactly the way I mean for it to, daytime care center is up and running somewhere, maybe Queensgate, maybe any place else. What does the St. Francis Seraph site turn into under 3CDC's guidance?
That's a good question. They were very, they don't know is basically what they've told us. And keep in mind there's the church property, the church itself, which is always very difficult to try to redevelop a church and, unclear on what that could be. 3CDC's actually redeveloped churches before. The former Taft Ale House, which is now the Melatonin Beer Project, that of course was a former church. I'm not saying by any stretch of imagination they're going to turn into a brewery, but they basically don't know what the plans are. I would always imagine that housing will be part of it. We have a housing shortage in the city and in the region as a whole, so I could definitely imagine there being a housing element to whatever they end up putting there. It's in a prime location. In over the Rhine. The buildings, that are next to the church they do not look particularly historic to me. Granted, none of this has been, through the Historic Conservation Board, where a lot of development has to go through in over the Rhine before it actually gets built. So it's all kind of up in the air. One thing, Jack, I should mention that's important here. We're talking about two different sources of money. The $5 million
Right.
that the city allocated for the daytime center of care, excuse me, that is sitting in the bank basically, and it's still going to be used for that. The money that the city is contributing to purchase the St. Francis Seraph properties, that is going to be from tax increment financing district that includes over the Rhine. And so we're talking about two different pots of money. So they're not robbing Peter to pay Paul here.
Yeah, no, I think that's an important thing to point out on this. That money the money's being used for what it's designed to being used for. We're certainly not dipping into general fund stuff to do this thing, and I know a lot of people like to get very harumphy about sometimes as far as what resources are being used to help folks in need. Let me ask you one other thing, Chris. As far as this plan for this day center of care partnership, does this feel like some sort of really big game changer move that the city is making? The mayor, I think, made a few statements about how this could really change the way the city delivers services. Does this have a vibe of like a game-changing kind of move?
I'm not sure. I think it's too early to tell, which is a cliche. Sorry, but you know, I think it's a missing piece, and I think that's right. That, I think they're correct about that. That they don't really have that today. The ultimate, when you talk to, I've covered homelessness for more than 2 decades in various places that I've worked, and I feel like the national consensus on this is the way to deal with homelessness is to get people a home and
Right.
a place that they stay every night, and they have a kitchen and a bathroom and all of that. And that's really, that would be the game changers if we were able to build thousands of new housing units in this region. That would solve the problem. That would deal with the problem. Maybe not solve it, but that would help a lot.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there's always a need, and we saw those stats from Strategies to End Homelessness about how inexpensive it is to prevent someone from becoming homeless versus trying to get somebody back underneath a shelter. Chris, what else are you cooking there with Business Courier? You want to tease out anything that's going to be coming up today?
I am working on a cover story today, so no daily stories from me today, but I will be back at it next week.
Right on. Chris Wettrich really keeps an eye on a lot of government developments and the role that government plays in business for the Cincinnati Business Courier. Chris, you do great work. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, Jack.